The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM. Welcome to the Center for Educational Media at Middle Tennessee State University. My name is Dr. Laura Clark, and I'm director of the center. And this is the SPED Collaborative Summer Academy. We have a group of special education teachers here today learning from each other, which is the model of the SPED Collaborative. Today, in our final session of the Summer Academy, we have a group from Metro Nashville Public Schools presenting on the impact of exclusionary practices in education. And I'm happy to welcome Dr. Adrienne Cook, who is the Exceptional Education Coach in Metro Nashville Public Schools, Ms. Sonia Dobbs, who is the Director of Exceptional Education, Metro Nashville Public Schools, and Mr. Christopher Floor, Transition Coordinator, Metro Nashville Public Schools. So we're so pleased to have you here today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're very excited to be here, and I know it's a long day and you're doing a lot of listening, so we're going to try to keep things interesting, all right? As she already said, we're doing a presentation on exclusionary practices in education, and of course we're looking at it through the lens of special education predominantly, but this impacts all different areas. So we are going to ask you guys to be quite vulnerable with us. These brave space norms are our guidance for you on how to engage with today's presentation. We want you to be vulnerable, and we want you to look at your own growth first. That takes a lot of introspection, a lot of being honest with yourself. Some of these things we're going to ask you may have done, and that's okay. Except non-closure. There are going to be a lot of questions as you leave, and maybe we don't answer them all. That's all right. Take the perspective of others. Try to understand where everyone's coming from. Assume best intentions. That's an important one. It's not personal. Lean into discomfort, fear. Think critically. Consider impact over intent. And practice mindfulness. So moving on, we hope that by the end of today's presentation, you're able to define exclusionary practices, distinguish between inclusive and exclusionary practices in managing behavior, explain the function and consequences of exclusionary practices, identify the supports needed to keep students in the least restrictive environment, and define disproportionality and explain the data behind it. So this is going to be a fully loaded conversation. I want you guys to take a moment to look at these photos that we've shared in this presentation. What do exclusionary practices look like? Take a moment. What do you see? What about them might be considered exclusionary? Does anybody want to volunteer a thought? I see in this first photo an adult, it's hard to tell, with a child sitting somewhat separated from their peers. While they're in the lunchroom, are they really included? I see some students sitting separated during recess or in the classroom. I see while we have a young man with a physical handicap that has an adult working with him, and yes, they're at the table together, are they really practicing inclusive learning? So let's define what are exclusionary practices, because this is a very broad term, right? And it is a broad definition. It is a type of action used by school staff that either removes or excludes a student from their educational setting or activities in the absence of meaningful evidence gathering and intervention. So this could include in-class exclusion. Some of those examples on that last slide were that, where the student might be in the room, but they were still excluded. That could be socially, academically, behaviorally. We see that behavior one a lot, don't we? Behavioral exclusion. Physical exclusion, that's the access, like removing the access to participation in activities. How many times have you seen a student who's been prevented from going to recess because they made a poor choice during the school day, but then they were excluded from that opportunity to be involved because of their behavior? Office referrals. This child just cannot be in this classroom. I need you to take him out and handle it. Give him some disciplinary consequence. Give him a referral. Expulsion or suspension. It's happening all the time. And unfortunate, right? Segregating students. So that includes special education classrooms. Sometimes we're using special education classrooms as a way to keep those more difficult behaviors away from the general population so that they're more easy to manage. That's considered exclusionary. Are we doing this with a database decision? All of this behavior, all of this exclusionary practice is part of a vicious cycle. We were talking about it, we were looking through all the research, and usually it starts with a behavior. So something's happening, a behavior is being exhibited that results in that child being excluded in some way. Of course, exclusion from whatever they're doing results in a lack of exposure to those academics. So now we've got deficits. And over time, those gaps just get wider. The more times they're excluded, the more times they're removed, it gets bigger. Understandably, that child then feels frustrated. They're now really far behind, and they know it usually. Their peers are light years ahead of where they should be. And the behavior increases in intensity. They're extra frustrated now. And now the teacher's extra frustrated because this behavior is not improving. So we exclude them some more. Now what we've done is we've just created this cycle of more and more exclusion. How are we really addressing the behavior? We're not. We're just removing them. So what's the impact of this, and what does the research say? So the National Association of State Boards of Education report that there were several worrisome trends, including continued reliance on exclusionary discipline that does not increase student safety, as well as disparate treatment of certain student groups. And you can imagine which groups those were. For this presentation, we're talking about predominantly students with disabilities, but it's not limited to just that. We're talking about most students of minority, either economically or racially, socially. All of our minority populations are in that certain student group category. So what are the consequences of not addressing behavior proactively? I love that visual. I'm surprised it's working. And as far as the school's perspective is concerned, what happens when a school does not proactively address behavior? These are probably mostly common sense things, but it's also what the data is saying. Staff attrition. Who wants to stay in a building where they don't feel supported in addressing student behavior? Annual performance measures aren't met. How are you going to meet those yearly expectations when all you're doing every day is managing challenging behavior? Decreased academic and social engagement, and that's in reference to kids and adults. Who wants to dedicate all their free time to a place they don't feel supported in? Disproportionality is increased, so that includes office referrals, suspensions, expulsions, and it's usually, like we said, targeted at certain populations of students. Schools also experience deteriorating school culture and climate. I don't know about you, but sometimes I've walked into buildings and there's a vibe and you can feel it within the first few minutes and you're like, there's some work that needs to be done here. That's the impact of not proactively addressing behavior in the school systems. But how is it impacting students? What happens to students when schools do not proactively address behavior? They miss content, obviously. If you're not there, how can you learn? Which results in poor performance. How am I expected to meet or exceed expectations when I haven't learned it yet? And that impacts my ability to feel successful at school. My mental health is impacted. I don't want to be here. They don't want me here. I don't feel encouraged. Repeated grades, dropping out. The older they get, the less invested they are because they've been told time and again, we don't want you here. We want to exclude you. So why should I try? And then I'm going to do something that I think I can do successfully, and that usually results in involvement in the juvenile justice system. We've just created that school to jail pipeline. That's what happens when you do not proactively address behavior in schools. And lastly, how do teachers get impacted when schools do not proactively address behavior? And I think you guys see this all the time. You are in education, you see it. Raise your hand if you've ever felt burnt out. We've all been there, and it's easy to feel that way. Low morale, increased apathy. Why should I care if they don't? It's easy to get stuck in that mindset, isn't it? Increased absenteeism. Well, I got 10 sick days, I'm gonna use them all. And then some. Low teacher performance. How am I supposed to perform as a level 5 teacher when I'm playing whack-a-mole? Stay in your seat. You go over here. Stop touching him. Put that down. You can tell. I have little boys too. Increased mistrust and loss of confidence. How can I feel good about working in a school where I don't feel supported, I don't feel heard, I don't feel like I can perform to my best as a teacher? That's just a vicious negative thinking cycle that's hard to break out of. And it starts usually with when behavior is not proactively being addressed. So the research is saying students must feel emotionally and physically safe, connected, supported, challenged, engaged, and socially capable to succeed academically. Thus, the way students experience discipline is a condition for learning. I think that last sentence is the most important. The way students experience discipline is a condition for learning. Are we setting them up to continue to learn, or are we alienating them further? Because the goal here isn't to get them out of the room, hopefully. It's to improve behavior outcomes in the long term and increase student engagement and success. Are we doing that with exclusionary practices? In recent years, we found that more schools rely on exclusionary measures and use them for minor or subjective infractions. The more exclusionary discipline practices are applied, the worse students perform academically, even after controlling for poverty and other demographic factors. It's in black and white. The numbers don't lie. It does not work. But we keep doing it, and not only do we keep doing it, we're doing it more and more and more. So to kind of summarize this research, there is very little evidence that suspending or expelling a student works as a deterrent for bad behavior. I've encountered many kids who actually like being sent home. They say, I'd rather be at home on my PlayStation. And they know exactly what it is that they need to do to get you to send them there. I've encountered many kids who know the discipline handbook better than I do, and they know how to use it. Research also supports that PBIS, positive behavior interventions, as well as targeted intervention, responding to early warning signs, is what does work. We're not doing enough of that, and we're doing too much exclusion. That is what the numbers are saying. So let's look at an example. This is representative of the United States nationally. Nationally, 13.2% of students enrolled in public schools have an identified disability. Of those 13.2%, those who received expulsions with educational services, which in my mind is like ISS, they're still in the building, they can still receive service, but they're not included. They received that at a rate of 23.3%. And then expulsions without educational services, which I think of as OSS, or maybe expulsion where there's not an opportunity to continue receiving supports, was still at a slightly higher rate than the number that represents their population in the total enrollment. So we are seeing disparities here in the way we discipline students with disabilities in the country, not just here. Let's talk about the legal framework for behavior and discipline under IDEA, right? It all kind of goes back to that. The cornerstone of IDEA is the entitlement of each eligible child with a disability to FAPE, which stands for? That was enthusiastic. A free and appropriate public education. I know you've heard it multiple times. That emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet the child's unique needs and prepares the child for further education, employment, and independent living, right? Stepping stone for life. School is a training ground for what comes next. IDEA and its implementing regulations require IEP teams to follow certain procedures to ensure that IEPs meet the individualized needs, including the behavioral needs of children with disabilities. So we highlighted that phrase because behavior is part of this. It cannot be separated. It has to be addressed. We're required to. It's part of the law, and it's what's best for kids. We cannot ignore that. All right, so it also says that IEP teams are required to consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports or other strategies for a child with disability whose behavior impedes their learning or the learning of others. And that might sound similar to a phrase you encounter on an IEP, maybe. So if you're not considering those positive behavioral supports, you're missing out on a crucial component of what the law is asking us to do. The IEP team may elect to address behavior through annual goals, or it may elect to address it through something like an FBA BIP, which you were talking about in this last presentation. I'm sure you guys are all experts on that now, right? So the IEP may also include modification to the child's program, supports for their teachers and other school personnel. I think we forget about that part sometimes. You can really offer trainings, additional opportunities for the adults in that child's life to receive support so that they can be more effective in implementing those behavior interventions. And that includes special education and related service providers, supplementary aids and services necessary to enable the child to advance appropriately towards attaining their behavioral goals. All of this is based in the law. So the research, the law, they do align here. Everybody here has probably heard of OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs. So it does say, according to their site, that schools may not impose discipline on students with disabilities in a manner that constitutes disability discrimination under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. All right, so we cannot discriminate against students who have disabilities. So sometimes those exclusionary practices, if you really look closely, could fall into that category of, yeah, this is discrimination. This isn't just discipline. And then generally speaking, we're talking about two ways in which a school's use of discipline could discriminate. So the first example is that a school subjects a student to unnecessary different treatment based on disability. So an example we had kind of been discussing is, say you have a friend with autism who's highly echolalic. They repeat everything you say. It's a bit distracting sometimes, especially if you're in a general education setting, and there can be a lot of frustration around how do we navigate this behavior because it's part of their disability. And sometimes that means we end up excluding them. But if we're removing them from the setting in which they are most capable of learning, say that child has an average IQ and really should be benefiting from that high quality instruction from that teacher, not a special educator, right? That could be considered discrimination because you're removing them from the setting in which they are entitled to be learning in, based on their disability alone. So we have to navigate that really carefully. The other scenario would be the school's criteria, policies, practices, or procedures have an unjustified discriminatory effect on students based on disability. And this example might open a can of worms, so I won't go down that rabbit hole too much, but consider sports, extracurricular activities. Many times those athletes and those sports teams have very strict policies in place about who is eligible for participation on these teams. You have to be real careful with that, though, because a student with a disability who then, I said not interview, you can tell how athletic I am, tries out for the team. Are they being prevented from access to an opportunity to be included with their typical peers based on disability alone, based on the way these policies are written? We have to strike a balance. Now, there's a lot of different scenarios you can consider here, but that's an example that comes up all the time in our world, and they have a point. This child should have access in some way, some form or fashion. Otherwise, it is discrimination. Disparities in exclusionary discipline place students at risk for negative outcomes. So we've already said this. Lower achievement, increased likelihood of not graduating. It just gets more and more likely the older they get. And then positive proactive strategies, PBIS, right? Reduce rates of discipline and improve school climate and student outcomes. We often see a lot of PBIS programs in place at our elementary schools. But I've noticed that as we get older, middle school, you see a little bit less of it, or the incentives are kind of far apart, and that the school buck system is implemented by 3.5 teachers. It's a little less buy-in. And then you get to high school and it's like a free-for-all. They can go to the pep rally. We got to be real intentional at all levels to seek out opportunities for positive behavior supports. So we're going to shift our thinking, and I'm about to hand this over to Mr. Floor, our transition coordinator and fabulous presenter. He's going to talk to us about what this looks like.
So how do we shift our thinking on responding to behavior? Is it as simple as just keeping kids in the classroom more? Is that all it takes? Is that all we have to do? That's the important question that we really have to ask ourselves as we go through this process together, okay? How are we going to shift our thinking away from exclusionary practices? So I want you to imagine different types of classrooms, okay? And these classrooms obviously can exist on a whole host of continuums, right? Think about classrooms where exclusionary practices are the norm. What does that look like? And what does it feel like for students and for teachers? And then what does it sound like? And then think about the other end of that, where the practices are more inclusive in nature. And how are those classrooms different? But we also want to make it a little bit more complicated, because I want us to realize that there are lots of factors that are driving our decision-making when we're in classrooms, because that's the key here. Why do we do these things? Is the intention to exclude students? I don't think that's the intention in our heart, but there's something else that's motivating our decision-making, and we need to get beneath that to figure out what's going on in our behavior practices. And so think about classrooms where teachers are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Are those classrooms rigorous by nature when we're carrying a lot of the intellectual labor of the classroom? No, because we have to let go in our classrooms a little bit. We need to be comfortable with students taking more of the action, doing more of the heavy lifting. And so on the other end of that spectrum is where students are doing the heavy lifting. This is more, the instruction here can't be that rigorous. And if it is, it's not that accessible. On the other end, students are carrying the weight. So we're going to divide the room into 4 groups right now. And so you all are going to see that we have a QR code up on the board. You can use your phone to access that QR code. However, we're going to keep it real simple, okay? Because we're going to divide you into 4 groups, and each group is going to have a different quadrant, okay? So quadrant 1 is right over here. That's where students are doing the heavy lifting, and it's more of an inclusive environment. And then in quadrant 2 over here, you've got students doing the heavy lifting, but there's still exclusionary practices that are happening. And then you look at quadrant 3, and you'll see that the teachers are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but it's still an exclusionary environment. In quadrant 4, there's inclusive practices that are still happening, but it's also the teacher is still doing a lot of the heavy lifting. We have 3 questions that we want you to answer for each of those quadrants, okay? One is, what do these classrooms look like? That's 1. 2 is, what does it feel like to be in these classrooms? And then 3 is, what does it sound like? Like, what are you hearing in these rooms? So, that being said, I'm going to actually look at this room as if it's an actual coordinate plane. So, we're going to say that this group over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you all are in quadrant 1, okay? And then this group right over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, you all are in quadrant 2. And then I'm going to bring you over here. This is going to be quadrant 3. And over here is quadrant 4, y'all right here, okay? So we are going to let you have these conversations on your own. And remember, it's as simple as 3 questions. What do these classrooms look like? What do they sound like? And what do they feel like? And I'm going to release you all to do some of the heavy lifting yourselves.
That would look like
We're excluding kids, and we're doing all the heavy lifting.
teachers doing most of the talking.
Yeah,
Right,
very
that's what it would
lecture-
sound
lecture
like.
style.
Yeah,
And also,
lecture.
teacher may be yelling.
I was gonna say, I thought it was a specific teacher we have.
Yeah,
We're the
Exclusionary
three.
teachers doing heavy lifting.
Exclusionary teachers.
Gotcha. I'm going to come in chicken and
Okay.
Okay.
That's problematic. How about
So
yelling?
lectures.
I was gonna say
Sending
yelling.
kids out.
I would say
would hear in that kind of classroom is, and I've actually had experience with all those things, so, is that control, it would be sound, you'd hear black, but not loud. Okay. Because the teacher is the facilitator, the teacher circulating, the students are also control. Because the teacher has given instructions, they all talk, but like, no.
So quadrant 1, talk to us. What did you all talk about in quadrant 1?
Okay, so we were talking about how the students do the heavy lifting part doesn't often come naturally to us, that a lot of us are kind of like lecturers, and we know we have this content knowledge to tell them, or at least for me, I'm a general ed teacher. I think I might be one of the only ones in here, but I know, like, here are standards I have to go through. I have so much to fit in, but it's kind of a learning curve of what can I do to actively engage them to where they're an active participant and actually like grappling with the work to understand it on their own. So we were saying that's not something that always comes easily or overnight, but you kind of have to take a step back, let them be wrong, and kind of actually work through it to understand the material.
Thank you. I really like how you bring up the point that it's not natural at first, right? Because when teachers have that impulse to kind of grab control back, sometimes we have to kind of get through that discomfort, right? Just so the students can get to the richness and the rigor that they need to learn. How about quadrant 2? What did your classroom feel like?
we were thinking more along the lines of the whole school, not just a classroom
Sure.
setting. I think that's where
Yeah.
we kind of got
Okay,
a little
that's
off
okay.
track
Talk to us
there.
about it.
So we were just talking about the school culture and whether, if a student can figure out how to get out of coming to school. But what if your school just doesn't have that option? What if your school, you still come to school? I know my school, for example, this year, if a student gets suspended, they still come to school. We have a setting there at our school that those kids will come to a different classroom but still be there in the building. So maybe taking out that choice from the student. And then we talked a lot about, what were your 3 words?
Well, look, see, and feel. So we also address how some schools just don't have the personnel.
Yeah.
And then how you look at it from the administrative teacher, administration, community, parent, and student. It all has different definitions, but it really came down to the basic part: how does the child feel? And the child shouldn't be there at all if you have everything in gear and everything synchronized. But anyway, that's where we're at.
I really like how this group, you guys really touched on, one, the systems approach is important, right? Because we do have to focus on that systems level change, but also that there is a continuum of exclusionary practice. And so there's a difference between the students being sent home all the time and still having to be in the building. Let's hear from group 3.
Well, our group was the teachers do the heavy lifting, and so we kind of talked a lot about how the classroom would feel, and just that it would feel very domineering, controlled, off-weighted relationships, and that not accepting of individual differences.
Yeah.
So just have it's one of those you could walk in and feel tension.
So your classroom is the classroom where quadrant 1 released a little bit, but then there was too much chaos and then the teacher grabbed the control back, right? Okay, great. Quadrant 4, last one. Talk to us about how your quadrant felt. And then we'll quickly move on to the next one.
Okay, this thing is intimidating. So we just kind of said that it really looks like everyone's included. You're at the carpet, you're at your desk, the teacher's doing everything, teaching everything, hitting those standards, especially as a general education teacher, just trying to get everything in and not releasing the students to do the things that they need to feel that rigor, to learn. And it's very kind of like, I call it a Charlie Brown classroom, like very, there's just not chaos, but there's just no fun in it, I guess.
Okay, thank you so much. So I remember there were a couple of groups that talked about that ritual compliance piece, right? The class appears in control, but is learning actually happen? Is it actually happening? So we want you all to think, how do we get beneath the teacher's decision making here, right? And so the question we have is, what is the function behind a teacher's behavior or decision making? Usually it's the other way around, right? Usually we're looking at what students are doing. But if we want to change the culture, we have to really talk about what we're doing. So let's look at this first piece right here, right? We have a teacher, and as we were just discussing on the previous slide, this teacher is beginning to micromanage their classroom, okay? That's the behavior. We're going to do a little bit of a functional behavior analysis right now, right? How many people here have written FBA BIPs? Lots of us? Yep.
Not on the teacher, though.
Well, yep, now we're doing something new, right? So say the teacher is micromanaging the classroom. The antecedent to that, why are they doing it? Well, they have a classroom that tends towards chronic misbehavior. So what is the teacher getting by micromanaging the classroom? Well, the consequence of this situation is that the students are being deprived of the opportunity to engage in learning, but the teacher is relieved of the stress of a chaotic environment. So in functional behavior analysis, what's the function there? Ooh, what about the sensory? Yep. So are they trying to access the sensory or escape it? They're trying to escape the sensory. Snaps on that. Say we got another behavior. The teacher coded a student behavior as the infraction was labeled as an assault on the student, but the child just smacked the other child in the face, right? So the consequence here is the student now faces expulsion. What is the teacher getting in this situation? What did they get by elevating the appearance of the behavior? The student now potentially is out of the building and they can escape the disruption, okay? We can think about this in terms of IEP teams, right? Because we're talking about data. So say the IEP team doesn't have enough data to review or discuss whether or not services have been provided for a student, and the student had committed an expellable offense. That student faces expulsion, but what was the team relieved of? Yeah, and that requires effort, right? To provide interventions with fidelity requires effort. So the destination is critical when you're responding to behavior. And you really want to think about, what are we trying to do when we respond to behavior? Are we trying to meaningfully improve a child's behavior, or are we just trying to get a student out of the classroom or away from the setting, moving them to a more restrictive place to relieve us of the stress? And that's a challenging question that we have to ask ourselves. So there's something in exceptional education, it's called the least dangerous assumption. And I'm looking at the time right now, so I'm going to jump ahead on this one. But the whole premise of the least dangerous assumption is, can I have someone loudly and proudly read this out loud?
Considering general education, first of all, students regardless of disabilities, it's a critical component of least dangerous assumption. Evidence and data collected should be discussed at each IEP meeting before making the determination that a student requires a more restrictive setting.
In the absence of data, the safest thing to do is to include the child. In the absence of data and meaningful intervention, the safest thing you can do is to include the child. Okay? So again, how you arrive at the destination is important. Okay? It's exclusionary if we are moving students without attempting behavior intervention. It's exclusionary if we are moving students without the data to justify the move. But if we're providing meaningful intervention with fidelity and we're collecting data, then we are just engaging in an inquiry process to identify the most appropriate setting for a child. Those are two very different things. And a lot of times we make a decision with the end in mind, right? To get the child out. The end in mind needs to be what is best for the student. So we were talking briefly before about positive behavior intervention supports. When should those be provided or considered? Let y'all say it. Ta-da! Always. Good guess. So across the state, we have multi-tiered systems of support, or RTIB and RTIA, right? And we have positive behavior support. So we know that this is a multi-tiered system. We're looking at Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, etc. This is Metro Nashville Public Schools process. We're not going to spend a lot of time explaining that. We just want you to understand the concept. But one of the things that we do in our department is that when we're encountering a school that wants to make a move on a child, is we really want to figure out, well, is there a problem in Tier 1 or Tier 2 or Tier 3 that we can fix before we make this decision and then alter the trajectory of a child's life? And so we have this Tier 1 classroom fidelity checklist where we're asking about rules and expectations. How is Tier 1 in the school? Tier 1 is critical. Is there a well-defined school culture? Are the teachers working towards something that they all believe in? Is there a mission? Is there a vision? I know this is an example of one school. This particular school identified a set of core values and then listed all of the examples of what those core values looked like in the classroom and said, we're going to reinforce those behaviors. It was very strategic, very clear. And then on the other side of that, we have universal expectations. Are the expectations universal and well-defined? So the school also identified behaviors that were misaligned to the core values, and then talked about as a team how they would respond to those misaligned behaviors. So when you're thinking about this, when we said universal earlier, we were talking about everyone, right? And so we want to think about this in terms of ice cream, right? In tier 1, everyone is getting a scoop, okay? And then in tier 2 and tier 3, well, tier 2, all of the kids are getting that same first scoop, and then they're getting a second scoop on top of the first scoop. And then you have students with even greater need. Well, they're getting those first 2 scoops and they're getting a third on top of it, okay? And so the question is on how do we identify the need, right? And so what we do in MMPS is we have a universal screener, right? We're looking at academics, but we're also looking at behavior. We're looking at attendance. We're looking at discipline referrals, et cetera, okay? And from the universal screener, we identify need, okay? And that's where the MTSSB data teams come in, which we're about to talk about in 1 second. And I'm going to pass the mic to the amazing Sonia Dobbs, and she's going to talk to us about how that works.
Okay, so I'm going to go through this quickly because I know that we only have a few more minutes. So what we do in Metro Nashville, and I'm sure you do it as well in your school district, we have what we call an MTSS. And for those of you that don't know, that came out of the Every Student Succeed Act, and prior to that, it was out of IDEA, because we were talking about response to intervention. So students come to us as is. We get what we get, right? And so some students come in prepared for school, and some come in not prepared for school. They have deficits in academics. They have deficits in behavior, social emotional. So we can't always assume that a deficit is due to a disability, correct? So MTSS challenges us to start working with the students as soon as they come into the building. As general education teachers and special education teachers and school counselors, we're working collaboratively together to work with our students to try to figure out how to get them to be successful in our school building. So we want to start off with high quality tier 1 instruction. So what does that look like for students that have behavior or do not have the social skills that their peers have? It starts off with having very defined expectations, having clear rules and procedures, teaching those rules and procedures where they don't have to guess and try to figure out what the teacher wants me to do, okay? So it starts off with tier 1 for every student. As we look at the students' behaviors, and I'm sure if you're like me about the second day of school, you kind of know a certain child's name, Johnny. You know exactly what Johnny's gonna do, but you can't really figure out why he's having problems. Well, we wanna collaborate with the other people on our team, and we want to start having what we call a MTSS team meeting about Johnny. And we wanna look at his attendance, universal behavior screener, the discipline. We wanna look at suspension data, academic, and the navigator data. And really what we're sitting down is that collectively, as a group, we're looking at the behavior that this student is displaying, academic behaviors, and problem solving. What can we do? Do we need to go to tier 2 supports? Do we need to go to tier 3 supports? Do we need to develop an FBA BIP? So as a team, we meet bi-weekly in Metro Nashville to look at that data and make a determination, tier 2 or tier 3. Now, students with IEPs are part of this process also. So up here for tier 2 supports, we have general education and exceptional education students. Remember, every student is a part of our classroom. If I'm a student that have a specific learning disability, but I'm starting to have behavior problems, that is a tier 2 support. We always want to start with the least restrictive before we go to the most restrictive, even if I already have an IEP. Okay, so we start with tier 2 supports. In some cases, when we go to tier 3 supports, we may call an IEP meeting, or we want to hold a support team to look at, do we suspect a disability? We've been providing interventions and support for this student, but the behaviors continue to increase. Is it just a deficit, or does a child have a disability? So now we're moving away from just thinking of it as a deficit and providing interventions. We're starting to suspect there may be a disability. So we may go into a support team. At this point, we're meeting about the student every 5 weeks because we want to put in interventions and we want to look at the progress or lack of progress and make a determination, where do we go from there? In some cases, we continue with the interventions throughout the school year because we see that the student is making progress. Other times, we may refer that student to a support team, and we may test that student to see if there is a disability, and we start the special ed route. But under MTSS, everyone is involved: SPED teacher, psychologist, school counselor, gen ed teacher, and looking to help that student be successful. So we're all providing supports. Remember, it's no longer a wait to fail. We start working with that student as soon as we start to see those problematic behaviors, attendance, suspensions. We start collaborating as a group to work with that student. So now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I know you all are experts on FBA, but I want to talk about the importance of an FBA. When we were talking about exclusionary and inclusionary practices, we all have those students, no matter what we do, they do something negative to get that attention. This is why sometimes it's important for us to really dig deep and look at what's the function of that behavior. And in Tennessee, it's actually a state rule now that we really do need to conduct an FBA to see what's driving some of that behavior, especially if a student is being exposed to restraint or isolation, or is exhibiting a pattern of behavior that impedes their learning. When a student exhibits a pattern of behavior that places the student or others at risk or harm, we need to do an FBA, BIP. It is a very diagnostic process where we're really looking to see what's driving that behavior, what is the student getting out of it. And we need that information in order to develop what we call a behavior intervention plan. When we move to this process, we're saying some of our Tier 2 interventions and Tier 3 interventions have not been successful. So we want a very individualized approach to see what's driving this student's behavior. Because in my world, and some of the kids I've worked with, that negative attention may be the only attention that they get. So I'm going to do this today so the teacher can yell at me. We think we're yelling to discourage the behavior or we're putting them out, but for them, that may be the attention that they need because they're not getting it anywhere else. So we want to make sure we're not feeding the behavior, we're actually using strategies to decrease the behavior. So that's the purpose of the FBA, so we individualize for each student so we can know how to decrease those problematic behaviors. So now I want to be very transparent. This is Metro Nashville. And for those of you that do not know, we're one of the 4 largest school districts in Tennessee. And this is our makeup. We have 80,000 students, 11,000 students with disabilities, 30,000 of our students are economically disadvantaged, and 19,000 are ELL. And if you look at our website, it tells you that we have about 100 languages representing about 200 countries in our schools. We have students that speak languages I never knew was a language, and I don't even know where they're from, okay? But this is the race that makes up Metro Nashville. About 4% of our students are Asian, 39% are Black, 32% Hispanic, less than 1% is American Indian or Alaska Native, and then Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander is less than 1%, and about 24% are white, okay? I want you to think about these numbers as we go through the next slide, okay? So when we talk about disproportionality, we're looking for overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a group in terms of expulsion, suspension, retention, and identification. So everyone gets a report card from the state and from the feds, and it tells us how we're doing on disproportionality. Around 2016 and 2017, the feds kind of developed a process to identify to districts if there were disproportionality have disproportionality and what happens when they have disproportionality. So the data that we're going to look at from Metro Nashville is from 2017, but we did not receive the data until 2018. So we're going to start off with identification. So remember on the previous slide, I said that Black or African American children represent about 39% of students with disabilities, in the district. But look here, students in category for the district, look at the percentage that we make up of students identified as having an intellectual disability. We're talking about 50% of the kids that are identified as having an intellectual disability are African American. And then also, when we look at Hispanic, we look at about 20%, and then for white students, about 30%. A little bit disproportionate, but not enough to say, wow. So there are some differences. Emotional disturbance. What race makes up the majority of the students that are identified as having an emotional disturbance? Black. Okay. So when we look at this, we know that about 80% of the students are Black or Hispanic that are identified as having emotional disturbance. Okay? Let's look at student retention. Who's being retained? %48 Black students, 27% Hispanic. So again, disproportionality can occur in identification, retention, and in discipline. Let's take a look. For out-of-school suspensions, Black students make up 65% of suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, and 73% of expulsions. The data speaks, right? Now look at students with disabilities. Black students with disabilities make up, Black students who have disabilities make up 80% of the expulsions. And that's why it's called disproportionality. Because 13% of the students with disabilities in our district, we don't have 100% of students that are Black that are identified as disabilities. It's very diverse, but they make up the majority of the students that are expelled. Now, sometimes we are overrepresented, and sometimes we're underrepresented. Look at this chart for gifted and talented. Who makes up a majority of the students that are identified as gifted or talented? White students make up 66% of the students that are identified as gifted or talented in Metro Nashville. The data doesn't lie. So let's talk about disproportionality. I want you to focus on students having 10 days of OSS or expulsion and students having ISS. Now, to make this easy, usually we want the number to be very close to 0, but anybody that's over like 2%, we're disproportionate, okay? They have a risk ratio that they use, and it would take me about 2 hours to explain it. So I'm just gonna say a simple version of Anything over 2 is a concern. Look at Black or African Americans. What's the risk ratio? 8.46. Now, I want you to look at the year, 21, 22, because that's a really high number. What happened in 2021? Kids have been out of school most of what? 2020? And we know that we had an impact. We had kids going through trauma, ACEs, lack of structure. So we saw a really huge increase in our disproportionality in the area of Black students. Now let's go to the following year, 22, 23. Did a little bit better. We brought that risk ratio down to 4, but we have a long way to go. We're disproportionate in terms of expulsions and suspension of Black children who have disabilities and also just Black students in general. Okay? So what are the consequences? So one of the things that the federal government decided is that when districts are disproportionate, they have to set aside 15% of their IDA money to address this issue. In some cases, that's a large amount of money that each district has to provide to set up things like MTSS, to get behavioral coaches, to have those supports for schools to really look at their cultural and climate and look at what we can do to tackle disproportionality. Because we know as we address disproportionality, expulsion, and exclusionary practices, it improves our school culture. And that takes for all of us to collaborate, gen ed, special ed, the whole building, all hands approach to address exclusionary practices. But this is one of the results of exclusionary practices. So my question to you, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to address promoting inclusionary practices, decreasing exclusionary practices? I have over 40 years experience working with people who have disabilities. In my 25 years in the public school district, one of the things that I know is that our students with disabilities, they come to school every day. Our kids of poverty, they come to school every day. And they come to school often, like I said, as is. They don't necessarily have the skills or the behaviors to be successful. So as teachers, we have to look at what can we do to break that exclusionary cycle. Because it starts with us, and as Chris mentioned, our mindset. Okay, what can we do to keep that student in the class? What can we do to help that student with the behaviors? Because we've been excluding and the problem has gotten bigger. So what can we do as a school to support our students? Any volunteers? Any suggestions?
Just continued awareness like you're doing today, just bringing it to our attention as teachers and just to realize, ask the question you just asked, what are we doing about it? Because obviously the question stimulates action.
Right, okay. Mm-hmm.
So my district was talking about this past year. And so I don't get to see all the data because I don't have all the access on Power School. So I looked at students that I knew were being suspended and expelled. And I went back and looked at their log entries, so their discipline referrals, their whole career as much as I could see. And almost every one of those children, their first referral ever was from the bus, from the transportation. And so then I started thinking about all these kids were being picked up by a bus, right? And that was them getting to school. So what if that bus environment, I've rode a bus before as a bus attendant. coming to school, screaming, yelling, like there's chaos everywhere. And then I get to school and I'm supposed to follow directions and be calm and be in my classroom. And now I've got to go home on that same bus and there's nobody looking out for me. And I just started thinking about that. And I asked some questions and I guess I figured out that usually school districts don't employ their own bus drivers. You contract out for that. And so it's a different set of rules. And I'm not saying the bus drivers are doing anything wrong. I'm not trying to pass the buck here, but I'm just looking and asking questions. And so I just wonder if that was addressed, if it would have an impact.
So I love that. We're going to look at from leaving their front porch to getting to school. We're going to look at all factors. Anyone else? I love how you really research to see what is the root cause of some of these exclusionary practices for our students.
Actually, I want to piggyback on what she was talking about with transportation and the chaos and so forth. A lot of times, at least my experience, and I'm talking Florida, not Tennessee, but middle schoolers are crazy kids, we all know. But the bus drivers don't always have the training they need to deal with those kids. The example I'm using is from my own son, who is a great kid. The bus driver kept bullying a minority student, and my son said, "You need to leave him alone. He has rights, and you can't do that." So she says, "Okay, everybody give a round of applause, because Gary told us about you have rights." And so, of course, the whole bus does. And then she writes my son up for total bus disruption when he's sticking up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves. And I actually ended up having the TV stations, the newspapers, and every public outlet that existed come to the school. We weren't at school property, we were just off-site from school property. And I said, all I'm asking is to give the drivers appropriate training for the children they are bringing to school, to have empathy for the children they are bringing to school, because they know the neighborhoods they're picking up from, they know the kind of kids they have on the bus, so what training do they need to better deal with those children? And in my son's case, they just put this driver in like Neverland so that she couldn't be dealing with those kinds of kids anymore.
What do you think the function of that behavior on behalf of the bus driver was? Why would they have done that?
I think the bus driver was saying, if you speak up on my bus, I'm going to suspend you. You're not allowed to do that here. So she was trying to be in a position of power and intimidate.
So it starts with a lot of the adults' behavior. We're wanting to see the adults in these scenarios reflect on the way we choose to interact with children and students.
I'm going to go back to what Chris stated when he did the heavy lifting, the teacher that had the exclusionary practices. Sometimes for our bus driver, it's that fear that things are going to get so out of control. So sometimes they do the real heavy lifting and they put all of these restrictions that actually does what? The opposite. It creates more chaos on the bus. So I will end with this, is that our kids come to school every day and we know the value of having an education. We know that when students go to school and they get an education, it improves their post-secondary outcomes. But what message are we communicating to our students? And it starts at pre-K. The research shows that most kids experience their first suspension or expulsion at pre-K. We say you need an education to have a good life in America, but every time you come in the building, we send you home. I want you to leave with that, and I want you to think about what can we do to promote more inclusionary practices and decrease the exclusionary practices, because it starts with us. We can have policies, we can have rules, but it starts with the teachers, it starts with our mindset, promoting those inclusionary practices. Thank you very much.
I'd like to add to that very last discussion about bus drivers to extend it to EAs and to custodial workers in the school and to food service workers and to to a wraparound 360-degree, who are the adults that interact with the children, to the extent that we can maintain appropriate confidentiality when we do that.
And I think that collaboration between all stakeholders, having a conversation, because what I found is having the EAs and the bus drivers and the support staff all having conversations about how to support that child. That's how we make a difference.
Yes.
One thing I would add to that is that there are very few adults that I've encountered in the world that don't have a capacity to reflect and to look inward. They just need to have the spaces like what we've had here today to kind of look at that and ask the deeper questions. And so extending that beyond teachers is super critical, talking about EAs and bus drivers.
As an EA working in the school system, I know that a lot of with children with disabilities, they will keep like information on a child and their IEPs and all that stuff away from us as protecting that child's rights and for medical terms, so like HIPAA, so like in the school, their privacy. So they don't give that information to us, so more or less we don't really know what's going on with that particular child. So if we're assigned to that child at a particular time and we are working with that child, we don't necessarily know what's disabilities that child has. We just know, okay, well, you're working with this child from this time to this time, and that's it. So we don't know if such and such is going to happen, this is how you need to react, this is what works for that child. So it's kind of like a catch-22, so we don't get all the information that you guys get, like the teachers. So it's hard.
And I've heard that from a lot of paraprofessionals or educational assistants, and one of the things that we've done when we talk about this data team, we always want to make sure that we're giving our paraprofessionals and our other staff, even our cafeteria workers, a copy of the behavior intervention plan. Because I may not know all the details about the disability, but I know when Johnny does A, this is how I should respond. And so we give them an IEP at a glance. We give them a copy of the BIP and especially a safety plan. We talk to them about the function of the behavior, and that's why we're looking at those data teams and we're doing more collaborating, because a teacher can't do it by themselves and an administrator can't do it by themselves. We have to work together as a community, just like in the school, it's a community. Everyone in there may have input about how to support that child. So I love that you brought that point up, because sometimes we do forget about the people who work directly with the students and sharing that information with them. That is very crucial to provide that to everyone that works with the child.
And you see that child in the hallways, or you can be walking by that child. That child could have a meltdown, and you may not be working with that particular child. That child may not be your grade level, and you may normally not have a one-on-one relationship with them, but something may happen in the hallway and all of a sudden they're having a meltdown and you were like, okay, what's going on? And then you go and approach the child, and then what?
You feel ill-equipped.
Exactly.
It's unfair to you and that child, because you're now being asked and tasked with that responsibility of how do I de-escalate an individual. I don't really know that well without the tools to do so. And so I think it's a great question. And I think it's a question you should ask your EE case managers and your administrators, because if you can advocate for what you need to do your job well, it helps them understand, oh, this might have been a perspective I hadn't considered. And so we're not going to assign malintent, we're just going to assign maybe a little ignorance. But you're going to bring it to their attention and say, for me to do this job well, I need some more information and I need a little bit of training possibly. That's a great point.
You can support that teacher in addressing that child's behavior if you have the information and the correct tools. And so sometimes that's how we have to present it. I really want to help this student perform better in your class, but I need a copy of that behavior plan or any information you can provide to me to help me work with that child. And I think a lot of times people think we can't give that information, but you can have that behavior plan, that safety plan. You can have a list of accommodations that we need to use with that child. We may just have to voice and say, I can help this student perform better in your class if I'm given that plan.
That was a great question. Thank you.
Advocacy.
Yes.
Mr. Floor, Ms. Dobbs, Dr. Cook, thank you for this presentation today.